Sorry, one of the hot topics in this area is the discussion around embracing and affirming neurodiversity, versus creating a treatment approach when looking at ADHD. I see both as being relevant and complementary. How would you approach this topic?
Yeah, I'd agree. By making a child feel like they have a deficit, my favorite framework, the one that has more evidence behind it than anything else on the planet in psychological terms, is a theory that I hope most people are familiar with, but unfortunately too many still aren't, and it's called self-determination theory. I'm going to drop another quick name and give another mild flex. The lead researcher who is responsible for self-determination theory is a guy called Professor Richard Ryan. He and his colleague Ed Deci developed self-determination theory in the 1970s. And over the years, I've become really good friends with Rich. I had dinner with him in Sydney just last week. My wife and I went out with his wife, and we talked all about this particular topic. I let him know that I was going to be having this conversation and asked what I needed to talk about. Self-determination theory argues that you and I and the children with whom we work all have three basic psychological needs. As humans, it's common to humanity. We need these three things to flourish. Now, to be clear, there may be more than just these three basic psychological needs, but the evidence absolutely unquestionably supports these three categorically. A stronger evidence base, like I said, than any other psychological theory in the world. And the theory says basic psychological need number one is relatedness. Now, I want to step back a little bit, actually. I'm going to come back to these three basic psychological needs in just a sec. But I think with this particular audience, I normally wouldn't do this for a typical audience, but for this audience, I think this is relevant. When we look at parenting styles argue, if you look at Diana Borman's research and Maccabee and Martin and all of the people who have had their fingers in the parenting style literature since the 1960s, when Borman lifted her ideas from a guy called Earl Schaefer, who developed a three-way model in the 1950s, she said that three things matter, building on his work. Number one, we need to have responsiveness in parenting. Number two, we need to have demandingness in parenting. And number three, we need to have autonomy support in parenting. Responsiveness means warmth and nurture. It means when your child needs you, you turn to them and you respond to them. Demandingness means you have limits and boundaries. Autonomy support, well, that was a little bit fuzzy and they weren't quite sure what to do about it. But basically, it was this idea that, well, children should have some say sometimes in some things. But it was the 1950s, 1960s. That wasn't particularly popular. And when Borman started to put this into a model, I don't know if you've ever tried to put three dimensions into a model. It's really complex. And so what she did was she talked about autonomy support, but she took the other two, responsiveness and demandingness, and she made a little 2x2 table, because everybody in psychology loves a 2x2 table. And she said, if you can be high or low on either of these. If you're low on both, you're a neglectful parent. Neglectful parenting leads to fairly poor outcomes for children. If you're high on responsiveness but low on demandingness, you're what's called a permissive parent. But here's where it gets curious. Over the years, people added additional words into that quadrant. They said, in addition to being a permissive parent, you're a laissez-faire parent, and you might also be an indulgent parent. Now, indulgence and permissiveness are very different things. Being laissez-faire is fundamentally different to that, but they all got lumped into the one. Borman's initial conceptualization and the best science still points to permissiveness. And the outcomes for for kids from permissive homes aren't actually that bad. They don't like authority. They don't like being told what to do, but there's that responsiveness, that warmth, that nurture that seems to support them in fundamentally developmentally healthy ways. Then if we go up to high demand but low responsiveness, these are the authoritarian families, my way or the highway. This is actually more damaging than permissiveness, because kids feel like they can't measure up, they can't be good enough. And then we have the authoritative parent. This has been seen as the gold standard of parenting since the 1960s. This is the parent who is really beautiful with responsiveness and really great with demandingness. Rich Ryan and Ed Deci have developed a model that calls into question the fundamentals of Borman's parenting styles. So instead of speaking about responsiveness, they talk about relatedness. And I think this is really important, because responsiveness versus relatedness, the idea of responsiveness is I'm the unilateral arbiter of everything that happens in this home. And I will choose whether I will or won't respond to you. In other words, all power is vested in the parent, and the parent determines, do I or don't I respond? Whereas relatedness, well, that's about connection and belonging and mattering. The second basic psychological need is called competence. Now, competence, again, is fundamentally different to demandingness. Demandingness is, I expect that you will live up to this expectation. Here are the limits, here are the boundaries. Now, careful parents will have demands that are developmentally appropriate. Nevertheless, demandingness is still centering all power in the parent, whereas competence is built on structure, frameworks, systems, scaffolding. If I want my child to be competent and have that basic psychological need supported, what I do is I say to my child, I want mornings to go well, and we need to develop a framework for mornings so that we can feel good about mornings. Quick pro tip, if you're working with families who are chaotic in the mornings, maybe part of their structure so that they can be competent in the mornings rather than chaotic, maybe part of their structure might be that they remember that the morning begins the night before, and that they set up a structure in the evening so that the kiddo is running around and getting their school uniform or their school belongings or their lunchbox or their shoes or their sports gear or their library book. They get that ready the night before so that in the mornings, they don't have the same pressure. Just as a quick aside. The third basic psychological need that DC and Ryan developed in self-determination theory, wait for it, autonomy support. That thing that got forgotten in Borman's model. The thing that only people who have delved deeply into parenting research know exists, autonomy support. So back to your question, Pedro, when we're dealing with ADHD, I think it's useful to look at basic psychological needs. If I've got a child who has regulation and inhibition challenges, my suggestion would be that coming down hard on that kid is going to make them feel completely incompetent, so it crushes competence needs. It's going to rupture the relationship because we've just chastised them, and ultimately we're going to step into control mode, which means that they're going to want to rebel and push back. Fundamentally, what I think we need to be doing is helping kids with ADHD feel competent. Helping them feel competent means developing structures that work for them. And the best way to do that is to bring their voice in. We sit down and we say, we seem to be really struggling with mornings, or every time I ask you to get off the screen, we have a really big problem. Or whenever you go to school and this thing happens, there's a blow up and I get a telephone call from the school. So we're highlighting, we've got a problem. The child knows it. And then we get to explore, why do you reckon that's happening? And perhaps we say to them, it could be your ADHD. But mostly what's going on here is you're struggling to regulate. The accelerator gets pushed down on your emotional brain. The limbic system fires up. The amygdala goes into red alert. And everything. Kids don't know how to apply the brakes in those situations. They just don't know how to slow this thing down. And so then we get to say to them, so we've clearly got a problem here. How do you think we can solve it? What can we do structurally? What frameworks can we put in place so that you can get a handle on this, so that we can build your competence? To me, that kind of a model, I call it the 3 E's of effective discipline: explore, explain, and empower. That kind of a model is going to help a child to have a voice, feel like they've got answers, so they're competent, and support relationships. That's where I'd be pushing, Pedro, in response to your question. I've kind of taken your question and reshaped it and molded it and come out the other end somewhere else, but I hope that that's useful. Do you want to say the question again to make sure that I got the question responded to?
No, it was about the main misconceptions. Oh, sorry, no, actually, there was the question about embracing and affirming neurodiversity versus the treatment approach. Yeah. Right.
So what we're doing here with this, as you said, it's a bit of column A and a bit of column B. We're trying to do both here by working through a process that satisfies and supports basic psychological needs. Our treatment process is affirming of the neurodiversity. I think that it's unfair? No. My sense is it's not appropriate for us to affirm something that is maladaptive. Okay, so ADHD, to get a diagnosis, a person has to be experiencing these inhibitory and regulatory challenges in a way that disturbs function, in a way that is maladaptive. I don't believe that we want to be supporting and celebrating maladaptive behaviors, maladaptive responses to challenging situations. So I've got a challenge here with a neuroaffirmative model when the neuro challenges lead to dysfunction. I'm absolutely about celebrating diversity and affirming the strengths that come from a mind that can go a million different ways and can sometimes be dysfunctional. I have informally, I've gone through, I've got a PhD in psychology. I feel safe. I'm on safe ground saying what I'm about to say. I've gone through the criteria for an adult diagnosis of ADHD. I tick the boxes really, really well. However, I don't claim that I'm an ADHD adult. Why? Because it's not maladaptive. It's not dysfunctional. I've figured out how to structure my life in a way that the strengths that come from having a brain that does this stuff, my world fits around that really, really well. I've created a world where it's not maladaptive and it's not dysfunctional. So therefore, neuroaffirmation, 100%, yeah. But if you've got a child who is in a system or a structure that is just not working, then if we want to be affirmative, we need to work out what we can do to change the system and the structure. I hope that makes sense. I know that it's one of those areas where
absolute sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Some people get very, very defensive about this and say, we have to be affirmative. We have to be affirmative. We have to be affirmative. I don't see any value in being affirmative when it's fundamentally destructive. And it's not that the behavior is destructive. It's that in the context of the school or in the parenting situation or in the relationship here or there, but this is not working for the child there. So is there a problem with ADHD? No, but in the context, yes. And so we've either got to, we've got to change the context fundamentally, or we've got to give the child, well, both. We've got to give the child the skills to adapt to the context, because the reality is not all contexts are going to, you can't always shape your world to make the ADHD fit.
Yeah, I guess to summarize very, very briefly, like you can still be affirmative without just completely throwing out the diagnostic criteria and the impact that diagnosis has.
Thank you.
Which is why the conversation gets lost sometimes, which is, every conversation these days seems to be very much on the one end of the spectrum of another, unfortunately. And this is probably just another side effect of it. It's just another conversation that people tend to take extremes instead of integrating both sides.
Great. And I don't think that it's healthy to be at either end. I think the polarizing approach, it doesn't support the kids. It's just not helpful.